Hmm. Motherfuckers. Shall we continue talking about vocal characteristics of the traumatized? We shall. And this time, let's also throw in depression. How do major depressive disorder and PTSD differ in their effects on vocalization? How do they cross over? What might be the similarities? And how can we use this information to better understand if we are dealing with a phase of post trauma symptomology or a dominating depressive condition? This article is called Childhood Trauma Affects Speech and Language Measures in Patients with Major Depressive Disorder During Clinical Interviews. It's by Eric Ettore et al. From the Journal of Affective Disorders 2025. And here they say depressive symptoms may overlap with or mask underlying post traumatic stress disorder in individuals with a history of trauma. In a meta analysis, Rytwinski et al. Showed that in individuals with PTSD, 52% also meet criteria for major depressive disorder. Other authors observed that in individuals with major depressive disorder and PTSD comorbidity, the average duration of PTSD symptoms was 16 years. Yet only 28.8% had a documented diagnosis in their medical records. This suggests that comorbidity between major depressive disorder and PTSD may predict chronic misdiagnosis of the PTSD. One potential explanation for this interplay involves the fluctuating nature of post-traumatic symptoms over time. According to a dynamic model proposed by Alarcon et al., these symptoms may be complicated over time by comorbid depression. So, the primary psychological trauma symptoms may recede as depressive symptoms take precedence. Okay. So much to say already. Doesn't this explain the complication and inefficiency in getting diagnosed with PTSD? For years, you might be kicked around with diagnoses of anxiety, depression, maybe OCD. It takes a long time in most experiences to finally land on post traumatic stress disorder as the real answer that's been there all along. And jumping off of what they said about the wavering nature of depression and PTSD back and forth, I want to extrapolate a little bit because the symptoms of PTSD often keep us from seeking help. The chronic stress, cognitive exhaustion, and defeat that go alongside do not promote appointment making or keeping. When we do have the spoons and spirit to see a professional, we might be in a post traumatic symptom recession, which has allowed the appointment to take place. This means the practitioner misses the PTSD and probably picks up on the more common comorbid disorders. Again, anxiety, depression, obsession. That being said, considering PTSD symptoms might last on average for 16 years, yet only about a quarter of people afflicted end up ever hearing that they might have PTSD, it is important to have diagnostics to pick up this underlying foundational problem with more efficacy, to know if a patient is experiencing one state or the other, and to recognize that there may be something deeper to address. They say large scale studies indicate that only 30% of individuals with major depressive disorder achieve remission following first line antidepressant treatment, while an additional 30% remain non remitted even after 4 consecutive treatment trials. One of the potential explanations for these findings is that individuals with undiagnosed PTSD, as we just heard about, are less likely to respond adequately to standard antidepressant treatments and may require trauma-focused interventions to achieve significant clinical improvement. So, if we have PTSD, but only the depression is being detected, then the traditional depression treatments won't work, especially SSRIs. But we will eventually relapse into post traumatic disordering again, potentially alongside the depression. speaking from experience. So, again, diagnostic improvement is needed to more accurately pinpoint and treat the issue. And this is where words and vocal signatures might come in. They tell us speech analysis presents a compelling opportunity to investigate disease related characteristics, as psychiatric symptoms often manifest through alterations in speech and language. This approach facilitates clinically applicable assessments of speech patterns, encompassing aspects such as speed, coherence, and content across various psychiatric conditions, including depression, schizophrenia, and PTSD. Advancements in computational linguistics, natural language processing, and speech recognition enhance the feasibility of using automatic speech analysis as an objective clinical measure of psychiatric symptoms. Okay. So, as technology improves, we may be able to use it to automatically detect signals of depression, schizophrenia, and PTSD. So, what are some of the speech features of these disorders? Consistent findings in depression research indicate prosodic and spectral features associated with major depressive disorder, including monotonic and flat speech patterns attributed to reductions in fundamental frequency F0 and F0 range. Okay, here's some extra information in case you don't know what any of that means, like I. Prosodic features give speech its melody and rhythm. Rather than individual sounds, they govern how we convey meaning, emotion, and emphasis together. So here we're looking at things like intensity, the physical measure of loudness or sound pressure level. This highlights which parts of an utterance carry the most vocal weight. There's also duration or tempo, the time units of sounds, syllables, and pauses. Speaking rate, pace, and pausing strategies convey emotion, hesitation, and sentence boundaries. And there is the fundamental frequency that they mentioned, F0. This is the physical measure of pitch. Changes in F0 indicate intonation, like the rising pitch for a question, and stress, e.g., emphasizing a word in a sentence. And then there are these spectral features. Spectral features analyze the underlying acoustic quality and the shape of the sound waveform. They look at short-term chunks of audio to determine the raw texture of the voice. These include formants, F1, F2, F3, the resonant frequencies of the vocal tract. The specific values and movements of formants dictate which vowels are being spoken. Do I understand what that means? Not exactly. Then there's spectral tilt and centroid. Spectral tilt measures the decay rate of energy across higher frequencies, helping to distinguish a breathy voice from an aggressive one. The spectral centroid indicates the brightness of sound. And finally, jitter and shimmer, with jitter referring to variations in pitch or frequency instability, while shimmer represents cycle to cycle variations in amplitude or loudness instability. So jitter is frequency instability, shimmer is loudness instability. We won't be doing a full education here on these speech features. I just wanted to provide a few extra pieces of information to get you thinking about all of these characteristics of vocalizing, and maybe you want to look into any of these yourself. But we've learned depression comes with monotonic and flat speech patterns, as well as reductions in pitch volume and range. In some cases, it's also been shown to affect shimmer and jitter, leading to pitch and volume instability, they say. Moreover, patients with major depressive disorder often display a reduced speech rate and utterance duration, likely linked to psychomotor retardation. This association has been noted concerning both the severity of depression and treatment response, particularly for temporal features such as pause duration and speaking rate. Pause duration and speaking rate, of course, being prosodic features of duration and tempo. But thinking about this, when we are barely functioning and exhausted chronically, depression, it comes through in our speech. Words are slower to start or to be finished. The brain is functioning at a slower pace and it can be heard. And of course, word choice is also affected by depression. They say linguistic changes, including heightened self referential speech and increased use of past tense verbs, have also been observed in depressed individuals. Furthermore, those with depression tend to convey more emotionally negative content while utilizing less complex vocabulary. Okay. We know from previous research that depression creates or corresponds with a past time orientation. So the words that we speak, again, reflect this inner state. And word choice becomes less creative because of it. Again, we barely have the energy to be alive and upright, at least in my world, let alone to utilize a thesaurus on the internet, physically, or in our own minds. We are so preoccupied. It's a struggle to convey meaning, to think that it matters to try. So we attempt to do it with the most simple, most top of mind words that are available, keeping in mind that depression and rumination go hand in hand. So there probably are a set of words widely accessible, while the rest of them feel very out of reach, untouched for some amount of time. Depression is like this cognitive broken record. So we rely or over rely on language that we've already been using, lacking the access to alternative neural pathways to seek out more fun, interesting, or accurate language. And most of the words spoken will be negative, in line with those broken record thoughts that we've been listening to on repeat. And when it comes to PTSD, they say voice analysis in individuals with a history of psychotrauma represents an emerging field with promising potential. Research indicates that subjects with PTSD typically exhibit a more monotonic voice, characterized by fewer pitch variations and slower speech. Similar to findings in depression, parameters such as F0 and source indicators, e.g., jitter, shimmer, and harmonics to noise ratio, are also affected. So, from this background information, we're hearing that there are supposedly similarities between PTSD and depressive speech. Namely, monotonic, inconsistent, and slower characteristics seem to span both disorders. And from both, we are quite reduced or diminished in capacity. And I would also say, spirit, until it is that we strike some emotional material that we feel furiously and potentially as if it is the first time we're experiencing it, although it is not the case. Suddenly, vocalization then changes, becoming more vibrant and alive in line with the inner experience, which, again, with post traumatic stress disorder, is a negative inner experience, but it is very enlivening. They conclude the intro saying, to the author's knowledge, no study has examined how childhood trauma can affect speech in depressed people. The primary aim of this study is to investigate the relationship between speech and linguistic features automatically extracted from clinical interviews. Furthermore, the study aims to examine the influence of childhood trauma on these vocal markers. So, what do they do? Methods. 27 participants with a major depressive episode were included. The severity of depression was assessed using the Montgomery and Asperg Depression Rating Scale and the Beck Depression Inventory 2. Childhood trauma was measured using the Childhood Trauma Questionnaire. Speech recordings from the Montgomery and Asperg Depression Rating Scale, semi-structured interview, and a free clinical interview were analyzed using speaker diarization. automatic speech recognition, and feature extraction. And what did they find? Depression severity, and speech features. First, our results demonstrated that speech features were strongly influenced by the severity of depression. We found that severely depressed patients had shorter speech durations, which were negatively correlated with symptom severity. So, in other words, the less we speak, the more we are suffering. One of the cruel ironies of depression when connection and help are needed, but seemingly infinite roadblocks stand in our way. Effective use of words, or some of them. From my experience, it's because one learns that communicating about depression leads to negative social results. It becomes classically conditioned, automatically, unconsciously noticing that it gets negative results when it tries to express itself. Words become fewer and farther between as a result. There is nothing nice to say, so why are we saying anything at all? And in this way, it contributes to the isolation that is so common in depression. They say, moreover, higher BDI-2, that's the Beck Depression Inventory 2 scores, were associated with less variation in both spectral and articulatory features, including reduced variability in formant resonant features, F2 and F3, harmonic differences, and prosodic aspects such as speech duration and voiced segment length. And if you're like me, what's all that mean? They say. These results are consistent with prior studies showing that individuals with major depressive disorder tend to speak with lower pitch variation and reduced vocal expressiveness. So, the measures we spoke about earlier, changes in pitch, resonance, harmonies, sentence duration, are reduced in major depressive disorder. We become flat, short, predictable, and less expressive using both volume and intensity. They report, we also found a positive correlation with MFCC1. And again, a little extra info on that. The role of MFCC1 in voice analysis is to describe the general slope or brightness of the sound, which determines how energy is distributed between high and low frequencies. It's an overall signifier of power. Unlike higher order coefficients that capture rapid variations in the spectrum, MFCC1 correlates heavily with the total volume, log energy, and the baseline amplitude envelope of the sound. So, back to that statement. We also found a positive correlation with MFCC1, indicating increased vocal constriction or reduced spectral openness. Together, these features suggest a more constrained and less dynamic vocal profile in individuals with higher depression severity. No significant differences were found, though, with jitter and shimmer in contrast to other studies. Okay, so overall, in so many ways, this means that flatness and expressive suppression are key markers of depressive speech, and they correlate with depression severity. Greater severity, less expression. Variation is not common, according to this research. Even when somewhat inappropriate or unusual, excitability is not really part of the depressive voice. And lastly, linguistically, higher depression severity was linked to simplified grammatical structures, decreased lexical diversity, and a preference for frequent, common words, reflecting a general flattening of affect expressiveness. Now, onto the post-traumatic speech disordering findings. Influence of childhood trauma on speech features. Our analysis revealed that higher scores on the CTQ were associated with increased vocal and syntactic complexity, as well as greater fragmentation. So, with greater childhood trauma, we immediately hear the opposite of what was implicated by major depression. Vocalizations become more complex, as do the grammatical structures that are used. However, cohesion becomes a problem. They say, our results indicate that increased traumatic burden correlates with total speech duration, syntactic dependency distance, which is the linear distance between two syntactically related words in a sentence, i.e., the dog barked. Dog and barked are directly next to each other, so this would be a low syntactic dependency distance of 1, and the number and density of lexical semantic clusters. These are groups of words and phrases in a language that share structural, grammatical, concept, or meaning-based mental connections, like orange and juice, arm and leg, together suggesting a longer speech duration and a discourse structure that is more segmented and syntactically complex. Additionally, CTQ scores were positively associated with adjective usage and consecutive word repetitions, indicating a speech pattern marked by evaluative language and lexical redundancy. Okay. So, overall, when we have strong childhood trauma scores, our sentences tend to get a bit, perhaps, convoluted. Words are becoming separate from each other in the sentence structure. We're including more words that aren't required, and instead we're sort of padding the sentence. Although we may be descriptive, it's not necessary to get our point across. So let's talk about lexical redundancy. This is the repetition of words or phrases that convey the same meaning within a sentence, making the text unnecessarily wordy. For example, close proximity. They mean the same thing. Collaborate together. Again, or the reason is because. Once more, these are redundant and unnecessary. One might say that under PTSD rulings, the mind is far more active compared to depression. There is more speech. The sentence structure becomes less rudimentary, as though thoughts are able to be tracked and held, elaborated on, and expressed with greater capacity. I would also like to suggest that PTSD's connection with a weakened self could be implicated here. When we're not sure how we're presenting to others, we can try a little too hard. Use too many words, perhaps. Repeat them in an unnecessary manner, trying to be heard, understood, reflected back to ourselves for self comprehension. But when using all of these words, again, it does not mean that things become more clear or cohesive. Our additional findings revealed that subjects with high traumatic load produced shorter utterances and exhibited smaller, more numerous semantic clusters that were frequently modified. This pattern may suggest a tendency toward more fragmented speech, which is probably an indicator of the condition of the traumatized mind, huh? They say several studies have shown that traumatic narratives may feature disruptions in chronology, incomplete sentences, repetitions, or a loss of coherence, with abrupt shifts between different moments of the experience. People with the dissociative subtype of PTSD may also have episodic memory impairments, which may influence the coherence and organization of the traumatic narrative. These disturbances in language and emotional expression are probably linked to disruptive neural connectivity. Okay, so when it comes to fragmented language, we can, of course, blame the fragmented state of the memory system. Traumas are experiences outside of normal life or understanding of normal life. That distinction causes the mind to hold separate realities that can't be meshed, although it really tries. But neural pruning and trimming, clipping the connections between our neurons, keep disruptive memories separate from the rest. And then we can't overcome these faulty neural pathways that keep recollections isolated when we're trying to speak coherently. This brain based distinction or discontinuity between events and experiences impacts thoughts in general, as there is no longer a stable thought foundation or understanding of life for all subsequent interpretations or decisions or conversations to be based. In other words, everything gets wonky and disordered. And we can also point towards a PTSD favorite for potential increase of this fragmented speech. One possible explanation, they say, could be the presence of disassociation. Indeed, studies of individuals with the dissociative subtype of PTSD have shown that their narrative accounts are more fragmented, with abrupt changes of subject, incomplete sentences, and breaks in chronology. When we aren't consistently present in our bodies or able to access our entire memory systems or minds, or we have parts answering for us. Check out the Parts and Disintegration collection for more information on all of that. We can't express ourselves as one whole unit, and the language reflects these diverse perspectives. A thought can't be held or fully elucidated, but rather it's picked up and set down as another portion of the mind takes over, as another memory leaps into the front of the picture. Altogether, this causes some degree of conversational chaos or disorganization, which is simply reflective of the state of the mind, they say. In addition, these patients, PTSD patients with disassociation, seem to have a tendency toward attenuated emotional expression or even affective detachment when recounting their traumatic experiences, which could influence the content of the discourse. And here we have to ask, doesn't the dissociative variety of PTSD sound a lot like it produces more depressive language symptoms that we spoke of? It comes with less affect, less expression, incomplete, potentially exhausted communication attempts. They address this when saying dissociative symptoms are found to co-occur with depressive symptoms. Thus, Fung et al. Assumed that post-traumatic and dissociative symptoms could be a contributing factor for depressive symptoms. In other words, PTSD plus dissociation might equal major depressive disorder, or at least similar speech features. When the strain of post traumatic stress disorder and all our fragmented memories become too great, we might leave ourselves disassociating, at which point we could slip into depression. What's the point in being present at all? Nothing matters, nothing ever changes, and we get the comorbid dissociative PTSD with depression in an instant, at least the start of it cognitively. This could explain the back and forth longitudinal relationship between the two states, depression and PTSD. As always, the answer is disassociation fucks us. And lastly, they say, we found neither significant relationship between fundamental frequency and childhood trauma questionnaire traumatic load, nor changes in the jitter, shimmer, or harmonic parameters that have been found in studies targeting PTSD. So, in this study, they found that tone, volume, and intensity aren't necessarily impacted by PTSD. We can still report vibrantly and with vocal variation when we're suffering with symptoms or have a strong childhood trauma load. And this is perhaps a reason why PTSD often goes unnoticed for so long. Whereas depression can be read through language by even quite unskilled practitioners or regular people. One condition, major depressive disorder, causes more ubiquitous language effects across the populations. The other, PTSD, may come with many language presentations, which might convey complex, inconsistent emotional states through somewhat overcomplicated and potentially discontinuous sentences. A presentation that could be misread as attentional disorder, for instance, rather than stress disorder. So, in conclusion, they say, our results revealed opposing trends. Depression severity was linked to shorter, less diverse speech, characterized by fewer words, fewer semantic clusters, and reduced articulatory effort. while higher trauma load was associated with richer, longer, and more complex speech. Utterances were shorter, with more frequent shifts between semantic clusters and more consecutive repetitions. These differences suggest distinct speech patterns underlying the influence of trauma load on depression that could be used as potential biomarkers. The links between depression and childhood trauma are complex and frequently found to be comorbid. The relationship between trauma and depression may be bidirectional, but several studies have shown a higher risk of depression in cases of childhood trauma. Clinicians need to be aware that trauma can influence the expression of typical depressive symptoms, and conversely, depression can sometimes mask the presence of trauma. This can lead to trauma being under or misdiagnosed. Therefore, an integrated approach combining traditional assessment tools and advanced speech analysis could enable a more holistic understanding of a patient's mental health status. Okay, and with that, we're here to wrap. Not sure how you're presenting or what you might be doing to attract unhealthy people into your own life? You might want to check your language characteristics. Record yourself and listen back. Write, journal, and revisit the literation. Are you using short sentences devoid of emotional information, filled with negativity, marked by past time orientation, littered with common repetitive word choices? Do you sound maybe a bit monotonous and robotic? You might be depressed. Or in a dissociative stage of PTSD, which could be the pathway into a major depressive spell. This might not be the best time to seek professional help, actually, as the depression treatment won't be highly effective with post traumatic stress underneath, and the depression is quite likely to be detected rather than the PTSD. On the other hand, are you writing copious amounts? But do those sentences seem to jump the shark with little relation between them? Does the perspective shift rapidly? Does the time orientation? Are there repetitive words listed in a row? Perhaps overly descriptive ones, which are, upon further review, unnecessary? Is emotional and experiential information bountiful? Do you sound emotional, with great variation in pitch and tone, as though the feelings are still raw and active? You might be in a more post traumatic experience. When the disorder isn't being masked by depression or disassociation, it might be a good time to seek diagnosis, especially if prior depression treatment hasn't been effective. I hope that this information has also made you think about how you speak, a potential indicator of your internal events and neural health in the various experiences of post traumatic stress disorder. So, fuckers, mind your mind. Understand what it's trying to work on, how that may be coming through in your language, and use those connections for better targeted treatments. Also, beware of how non practitioners might be using those same cues for their own good. Till we speak again next time, hey, do a fun little experiment and listen back to different episodes of this show where you absolutely will hear an uptick in my PTSD and then later depressive language. But to be a little less snarky about this, thank you for being here. Please be safe out there, whatever you're talking about. And I'll talk to you again real soon. Cheers, y'all. Hail yourselves, and bye bye.